I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. In today's episode, we are diving deep into the murky European waters of the ad tech data ecosystem. It's a sprawling, often opaque network of data brokers, advertisers, and platforms that track, profile, and target users across the web. At the heart of this system's compliance lies a somewhat controversial mechanism, the Transparency and Consent Framework, or the TCF, which in Europe was developed by IAB Europe. This framework is designed originally to help companies comply with the GDPR by standardizing how users may consent to data that's collected and shared. Since that development, the TCF has faced intense legal scrutiny in Europe and has left open questions regarding expectations for each member of the European ad tech data ecosystem. Most recently, in May of 2025, a Brussels court weighed in and found that IAB Europe was not just a standard setting organization, but a joint controller in its own right. In fact, it may be one of many controllers who are involved in the ecosystem from the point that data is originally collected about an individual visiting a website to the moment that a contextualized or personalized ad is delivered to that user, or to the end when ROI on that ad is measured to gauge its performance. So what does all of that mean for the future of consent in the European digital advertising world? Is the TCF, or that Transparency and Consent Framework, a meaningful tool for user empowerment? Or is it just another layer of compliance? And frankly, who is responsible and liable when consent is imperfect or insufficient? And what does that mean for entities who did not collect that consent, but rely on that consent? These are really important legal battles, which we'll explore on this episode. An important note, however, the ad tech world has a number of different types of legal obligations that are associated with it. And so today we'll focus on how the GDPR is being interpreted to address these consent and transparency frameworks, but we won't try to cover all of the other jurisdictions. We'll save those for future episodes because frankly, there's just too much to say to cover that in a single episode. So in Europe, let's ask these questions. What should advertisers and publishers do next in Europe? That seems to me as the most important question as we try to drive forward our collective compliance. To discuss these questions and more, I've invited my partner, Etienne Drouard, to the podcast. Etienne is a member of our Paris team and works with companies daily on data compliance in and around the ad tech world. Etienne, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Scott.
So, Etienne, I'm hopeful maybe we can just start. Let's think about this at the basic levels. I think one of the real challenges for data protection lawyers has been the ad tech ecosystem, and in particular, how organizations seek to comply with the GDPR while still allowing all of the internet-based, technology-based advertising that we are well accustomed to, in which, largely drives the economics of the internet. Maybe you can start there. I know that there is the IAB framework, which is a very popular one for organizations to use. How, in your experience, have organizations sought to comply with the GDPR while being able to engage in online advertising?
So when GDPR has been adopted, they were looking for a way to collect a valid consent from a user. But most of advertisers don't have any direct relationship with the user. So the industry needed a standard from which A publisher of a service could validly collect the consent of user, and this consent could be distributed to the rest of the ecosystem. Intermediaries, demand-side platform, service-side platforms for real-time bidding purposes until the advertiser. So the IAB Europe has been creating a standard, the TCF, Transparency and Consent Framework, defining for which main purposes a consent could be collected by a publisher and then distributed through what is called a consent string, defining a consent, a cookie ID or user ID, some purposes for which the user has provided his or her consent, and a list of vendors, members of the IAB Europe, to which this consent is granted and provided. And this standard has started since 2017, right after the GDPR. It has been evolving in various versions because the number of purposes for which consent was obtained had some overlaps, needed some clarifications and a better transparency. And the IAB Europe has been structuring a standard for the advertising industry in Europe, evolving and growing a lot. The number or the proportion of the TCF standards on the EU advertising market is now almost 80%. 80% of any automated advertising system of a purchase and sales of data and audience, etc., results from these consent strings distributed by the standard of the market, the IAB Europe TCF.
So if I'm thinking about this correctly, then, right, because the ad tech ecosystem has many different participants, that data can move from not only the publisher of a website to their service providers, but also then to advertisers, to the technology that supports those advertisers, to the ad brokering organizations who are supporting to be able to place those. The list goes on and on, right? There's a lot of organizations involved in the decision as to whether, when Etienne goes to a website, whether you get served an advertisement for a red shirt or a blue shirt, right? There's a lot that goes into that. And it may seem instantaneous to the user, but there are a number of entities who are processing data in order to inform that decision. And if I'm taking what you're saying correctly, that's been a bit of a challenge under the GDPR and frankly under other legal regimes, including in the United States under the CCPA and all the state laws around, well, obligations are that you have to, one, be able to be transparent to users about how their data is being used. You need to provide an accurate notice of processing. And two, you need to establish a legal basis for processing. And if I understood you correctly, the way that organizations have done this in the past is they say the legal basis for processing is consent, and the notice would come from the publisher, meaning that all of the obligations for supporting everyone else in this ecosystem and their processing all is from the original notice and the original consent that was obtained by the publisher, because frankly, none of those other entities involved in this business have the opportunity or the logistics to serve up a notice or to obtain consent. Frankly, they don't have any direct relationship to the user. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. So the tool for collecting consent is consent management platform, which pops up on the website you are visiting. It is, I would say, implemented with the settings defined by the IAB Europe. And this CMP, consent management platform, is provided to you by the publisher using a service provider operating the consent management platform. The settings of the CMP define some purposes that have been defined and framed by the IAB Europe. It displays also some boxes to tick, whether or not you would accept one purpose and refuse another one. This also has been defined by the IAB Europe. And on the publisher side, this CMP provides the various choices that are available to the user. Once the user have said yes to some purposes, no to some others, or yes to everything, or no to everybody and any purpose, then a data flow from the CMP goes over the advertising networks with the ID of a cookie or the ID of a device, plus the purposes that have been accepted by the user, and the list of vendors, member of the IAB Europe, who were present and listed when the user has provided his or her consent. This framework enables advertisers that have no direct relationship with the user to receive consent from a publisher who has obtained such consent from a user, and therefore use any data resulting from a cookie, for example. So this framework is a way to collect consent from the publisher and display your wishes and purposes to the rest of the ecosystem. The members of the IAB Europe are advertisers or their intermediaries that play a role in gathering data, consumption data, browsing data, purchasing data, in order to define some segments, to define a target for an advertising campaign, and enable the system to display targeted advertising to end users. And these people, having no relationship with the user and being in a contractual relationship with an advertiser, receive this consent and process it using this protocol, which is available from any publisher's website, almost, and which is displayed across members of the IAB Europe. So this is a way to collect consent for the rest of the ecosystem. And this is also a way to rely on a same structure and definition of the purposes that have been proposed to a user.
So it's like that consent string that you're referring to is going to be that kind of the ultimate source of truth as to what the person agreed to. And then, the information that's associated with the cookie ID or an advertising ID, it then gets tagged with the attributes from that cookie consent string. And wherever that data goes inside of the participants of this space, it always has that tags associated with it. And as you can imagine, Etienne, my next question is going to be then, well, that's interesting because that means that a lot of entities are all relying on the same consent, the same notice. And my guess is that there will be instances where disputes may arise between the members as to whether any individual participant in the ecosystem is processing data correctly, and potentially what liability does that create for others. And so that, to me, I think is a key question, which I know is now subject to litigation.
Exactly, because when you receive a consent string, it is your responsibility to comply with the items of this string. If you did not get any consent for profiling purpose, will you comply with this signal or will you just ignore it? And the idea was who's responsible for which use or misuse of this consent string. And the question has been raised whether the IAB Europe was responsible for defining these consent strings, but also for any misuse of the consent string by the vendors, members of the IAB Europe. And this question of liability was very important because when it has been creating this protocol, the IAB Europe was not considering itself as a data controller. They considered that they had defined a protocol, but that they were not processing any personal data themselves. The association IAB Europe itself, established in Belgium, was saying, I'm not even a data controller, I'm just defining a standard, but I'm not using it for myself. I'm not processing data resulting from it. I'm just distributing a framework of data to the stakeholders of this market.
I mean, that makes sense because, my guess is that IAB Europe is saying, well, we're not actually receiving any of the personal data, right? We're a standard setting organization. We're coming up with a methodology through which we can support all of the members to be able to lawfully comply. In other words, given that the relationships here are intricate and interdependent on one another, that if everyone doesn't agree to play by the same rules, then it could be that nobody is playing by the rules. But if I think about this more generally, I think a key question in my mind is, suppose I'm a publisher and I'm ingesting data from my users, from the people who see my content. And then I take that data, get the right types of consents, and maybe somebody agreed to use the data for behavioral advertising, but didn't agree to use the data for some other type of purpose. And I tag that into my consent string or the tagging for that specific user, and I disseminate it to other members. So what happens if one of the entities who receives that consent string and that data, which was properly collected, and they ignore that consent string, they advertise in ways that were not permitted? Does that create liability for the publisher because they were the ones to have originally collected that consent? Does that create obligations for the publisher for them to reasonably satisfy themselves that other members within the ecosystem are going to also comply with these rules? It seems as though you have this now real trust relationship needs to be built between all of the members of the advertising community in order for this to work.
So we got dozens of decisions between 2018 and until now, 2025, saying that the publisher could be responsible for any misuse of data because the purpose would not have been respected by a recipient of data. And the publisher was in a kind of unfair situation because they were able to control the way information is provided, the way purposes are presented to the user, the way the consent is expressed by the user. But however, there was no solution for a publisher to control the use of data by third parties. And lots of publishers have been sanctioned because of the misuse of data by a stakeholder of any advertising network. They were claiming that they were not responsible for the rest of the market, but however, lots of them have been sanctioned during the past 7 years, despite their argumentation saying, I'm not responsible for third parties' responsibility. And this is where there was an absolute need for clarifications when you are in joint controllership situations, because several stakeholders have been defining some data processing means and purposes. How could you allocate the responsibility of each of them through a joint controllership situation?
So, I think, Etienne, that's where my sense is that this court decision is a welcome development, because joint controllership is one where it carries a significant amount of potential liability. As I understand the rules here is that when you're a joint controller, you are potentially jointly and severally liable with the other joint controllers for the processing, meaning that if joint controller 1 does something unlawful, joint controller 2, who may have done nothing unlawful, could still be liable for the actions of joint controller 1, right? That is a significant liability for other participants. And if you're talking about something as complex as the advertising and ad tech ecosystem, then all of a sudden it can get really precarious as to potential liability for any entity who is engaged in advertising to cause liability for every other entity inside of that space. But the court here indicated, well, no, we're not going to go that far. We're not going to make it that every entity is now liable for the actions of the other entities. And that, to me, is a welcome sign of relief for organizations who participate in the IAB framework. Is that your point of view?
Oh, yes. And it's a good clarification of legal concepts that came from civil responsibility going to data protection regulation and not having exactly the same meaning. Joint controllership means that the purpose and means of data processing could have been decided by several entities. But it doesn't mean joint and several liability regime. It has already been clarified in a Planet 49 decision from the ECG adopted in 2019, saying when there is joint controllership, the Data Protection Authority should investigate the respective roles of each party in determining the purpose of use and means of use of data, but also their effective use of such data, the scope of their obligations, the scope of their control about a data processing activity, and in case they are responsible for transparency, for example, they may not be responsible for the use of data itself by a third party. And this clarification was made clear by the European Court of Justice, but not in a specific situation dealing with advertising networks. And here, with this Belgian Market Court decision about the IAB Europe, coming from another ECG decision from the European Court of Justice, we have a clear scoping of the liability of joint controller. They are responsible for what they do. When they define purposes and means altogether, it doesn't mean that each of them process personal data. In case one of them is responsible for displaying transparency and information to the user, this market player should be responsible for the clarity of information and completeness of information. This is the role of the publisher, for example. But when one stakeholder receives data and does not comply with the consent string which defines the scope and purposes of use of data, this market player will be responsible for this misuse of data and not the publisher and not the other stakeholders. So it is a very interesting clarification that is not a precedent. We had previous decision saying that joint controllership doesn't mean one responsible for the others, but now we have a very clear case-by-case basis requirement made to data protection authorities. They should define to what extent someone is a data controller or not. And then after, if someone is a data controller, it doesn't mean you are responsible for security, data retention, or the misuse of data by any third party. So the duty to investigate and specify each obligation of a given data controller is now made very clear, which means that the catch-all responsibility we had before should now be challenged and could now be challenged, because joint controllership doesn't mean several controllership.
So that's really, an important development, and probably hopefully reassuring to many of the entities who are participating in the space. I guess now the key question in my mind is, Etienne, is, what are organizations doing in light of this legal development and this court decision? Is there anything that they have to do different than perhaps they've done before, or things that they should be enhancing their processes, given the way that the court has established the independent responsibility of each entity who's processing data inside of this network?
More than ever, document your activity in a data protection impact assessment or in your registry of processing activities. You should define and describe what you are doing. I'm receiving data for which consent has been collected by a third party. Let's describe where we stand and what is the scope of activities of a company. Am I in charge of informing users about the purposes? Not because I receive consent, but I'm not in charge of displaying. So documenting your activity is the first way to save your situation, because if there is any assumption of liability, you can say, no, this is not what I'm doing. I'm from this part to this part of a data processing operation, and this is what I'm responsible for. So instead of being In a defensive situation, in case there is an assumption of responsibility, you can be proactive in your documentation drafting, describing exactly from which point to each endpoint you are processing data or performing any obligation under the GDPR. Second point, this decision gives back a better role to contractual relationship. Instead of being useless or meaningless because regulators did not take care about the definition of each party's role in an agreement, agreements come back when you can ask for some guarantees from your counterparts about their role with data processing, and therefore it is another way to document the contractual relationship, but also the allocation of responsibility you may have with another party. It's not bulletproof because regulators can still challenge the legal qualification of each party, but the more you stick to facts, the better you are. So your documentation, your contractual relationships are two big pillars of your safety. The last one would be trying to show that you are testing some of the practices of the stakeholders you are in contract with when they collect data or when they give you data. If you ask them regularly, could you give me a context of consent collection from a user, an example of your consent management platform? And if you do that regularly, this kind of due diligence subject, it is balanced. It doesn't cost too much to track everybody's behavior, but asking some questions to your business partners when you have a regular relationship with them would show that you try to be in the best position of understanding your counterparts' activities compared with yours. In case of an investigation, it makes a huge difference, showing that you've been quite proactive in understanding the way data that is coming from a counterpart has been collected. So contracts are good, and in case of an investigation, showing some due diligence processes, even if they are not systematic, would be a great way to save any misunderstanding and avoid any misunderstanding of your liability.
I think those are really good practice points, Etienne. And then maybe one observation that I'm interested in your perspective on is that as I hear this development and thinking about this from a regulator perspective, one other way of looking at it is saying, well, okay, we're no longer able to just go after the publisher and then say everyone else is responsible because of issues on the publisher side, or we're not able to go down to the ad tech entity and then say everyone else is responsible because of the actions of the ad tech ad tech company. So where that leaves regulators perhaps is looking more individualized reviews of any of the participants and saying how in your role were complying, which makes it maybe a little bit more difficult for the regulator, but also at the same time for our clients and for organizations who are engaged in this type of advertising, that they themselves are going to say, how is it that you were complying as opposed to just relying on the actions of the third party?
Yeah, but it's much better to anticipate this obligation to clarify your role and scope of your liability instead of receiving a report after an investigation from a regulator saying someone has been doing something wrong and therefore you are responsible for it. And so far, that was the case. As a publisher, as an intermediary defining audiences for targeting purpose, or as an agency displaying advertising campaigns on websites, you could have been responsible for lots of things without being even asked what was the scope of your activity. So I'm not saying it is going to change tomorrow morning because regulators have a kind of bad habit with this approach of assumptions. But however, if you document your situation and if you push regulators demonstrating the scope of their investigation concerning your business, you'll be in a much better situation than being assumed to be responsible for the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, very helpful. Well, Etienne, I really appreciate your willingness to share your expertise with our audience. I think this is an area of such complexity that I think is commonly misunderstood. And so I really welcome the opportunities for these conversations to kind of bring some simplicity and order to something that is otherwise difficult and opaque.
Thank you very much, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.